Today I'm comparing multiple airbrushing options as well as using no airbrush at all. So I'll go through all of these to answer the question: do you really need an airbrush? And if so, which one should you get? We'll do multiple tests to answer this, and let's start with... For all of these tests, I'll be using a bunch of regular Space Marines, which I wanna add to my existing army. Die! First, let's use what I would say is the shittiest option for priming, but it still works. Brushing the primer on your minis is somewhat of a challenge. Obviously, it's much slower, and the paint can easily fill and clog the recesses, obscuring the details. Most of these bottle primers are meant to be airbrushed, so you get more dispersed, even coverage. By using your brush, you have to constantly fight the pooling paint, so there is also a chance that you build some texture. Which, spoiler alert, has actually happened. And that's despite the fact I used multiple layers instead of one. I also decided to switch to Vallejo primer from the AK one, because it's just better in my opinion. And after like 20 minutes, not counting the drying time, I guess I got it properly primed. Again, there definitely was some texture here and there, which was mostly noticeable on the shoulder pads and other exposed parts, but other than that and the occasional splotchiness, it's alright. Okay, it's time to test this monstrosity of an airbrush. This is like your cheapest, most budget-friendly option, because not only do you get the pistol, but also this small USB-charged compressor. The first problem with this setup is that when the compressor is on, you keep on spraying air out of your airbrush. So essentially you can't control the air coming out with your trigger, which makes your dual-action airbrush a single-action one. With dual-action airbrush, you can release the air by pressing the trigger, and then release the paint by pulling the trigger. However, in this case, we are only able to pull it, and control the paint released. The air flows all the time. This can lead to some problems when you aim at your mini in the same angle for too long, because it'll sweep away the paint. Yet, for priming purposes, this works just fine. And honestly, for 30 bucks, this is pretty damn good. But we'll see how the latter tests go. After trying the good old almighty paintbrush and the cheapest airbrushing solution, it's time for the mid-range airbrush. The fact that now I could control both the airflow as well as the paint released made it much more enjoyable, and a tiny bit faster. But other than that, in regards to priming, there is little difference. Funnily enough, my $200 airbrush didn't like me using it for priming. Now, it is true that I got this one for detail work, but I wanted to give them all a fair treatment, so that's what I do anyway. The nozzle size is 0.2mm, and because of that I encounter clogging and a dry tip quite frequently. And you know what I say about dry tips. It's not that bad, but I would certainly use different airbrush, or at least different nozzle size for priming. If you can go outside with a spray can and people won't look at you like a vandal, I would consider a spray can to be the most convenient solution. But all of these are viable. Maybe the paintbrush is borderline. Yeah, and this is my merch. Pretty cool, right? I have 2 designs so far and both are awesome, so check the link in the description. But anyway, there is one thing you can't do with a spray can, and that is purposely painting the reflections. This I would consider to be the meat and potatoes of these tests, because if you wanna paint your army fast, this will help you tremendously. Honestly, if you don't wanna use your airbrush for priming or anything else other than painting reflections, it's still very much worth it. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To paint all the light on the white armor, I am using a Liquitex white ink, and starting with my premium airbrush. Unsurprisingly, it works just fine. However, it certainly isn't as fast due to the nozzle size of 0.2mm. That is like the smallest workable size in my opinion, and most often you'll encounter anything between 0.2mm up to 0.5mm. Larger nozzles are definitely more suitable for army painting, which is pretty apparent here given that we have as strong of a stream as your PP when you get erect. It's not all that bad though, at least it gives you a great control over how much you wanna paint. Since we are just using pure white, if you don't spray too much, you get a gray gradient. And the more you spray, the more it leans towards white. Like that, I can precisely choose which parts to be brighter. So, for example, the helmet is gonna be the brightest. In a similar manner, you can do that for any part of the Mini. Now, I know what you're thinking. But Zumikito, I can just do that with Zenithal priming, you piece of shit! Whoa, hold your horses, partner! In fact, you can't do that with a spray can, because only with an airbrush are you able to pick out precisely what you want. It's more obvious on this Mini than on the Space Marines, but consider how precise and intentional I can be when sketching the light, and then I could use contrast paints and inks to get really far super fast. So this would be like your higher quality version of Slapshot. But anyway, as I said, obviously my premium airbrush works for this just fine. It's super precise, but as you'll see later, a bit slower than the mid-range solution. Sketching the light with this one was much faster, despite the fact the nozzle size wasn't that bigger. In this case we got 0.3mm. Indeed, this airbrush allows more air and paint through the nozzle, which also means a bit less control over the paint released. But honestly, for army painting, it's a good trade-off. The real test though is whether this piece of shit of an airbrush can work for that. So I aimed at my Mini, pulled the trigger, and... What the f*** is this? This is not what I signed up for! Jeez! Yeah, well, obviously this can't work, because the small compressor doesn't have enough pressure to have a steady stream of air. I even tried adding more thinner, which didn't work. But hold on, didn't Ninjon use similar kind of airbrush in a video without a problem?
This thing does produce the proper airflow given standard Mini painting acrylic paint, and...
I've been f***ing scammed! Well, actually, I looked up the airbrush set that Ninjon was using, and it's entirely different model. And in fact, close to this price you can get a regular airbrushing set without using this subbar compressor. Okay, so clearly getting the cheapest solution won't get you anywhere. But what about the paintbrush? I prepared my wet palette, loaded up some black and white paint, and started painting the reflections. Manually. I used a combo of layering and wet blending and dedicated a maximum of 1 hour to paint it. And once I hit the 1 hour mark, this is what I got. It's not bad, but it makes something what should take you at the most like 10 minutes a 1 hour ordeal. At that point I would just take the Zenithal priming road and leave it at that, because on an army painting level this is really slow, especially when you still have to paint the details. But what about... Glazing with a brush is quite easy. Just thin down your paint quite a bit, wick off the excess, and shove it up your Mini's ass. My goal here is to create this sort of cool atmospheric shading by applying very thin filters. As you can see, it works quite nicely, but again, it takes a long time to do everywhere. By using my brush, it's also inevitable that some brush marks will be visible. Usually, I would do some back and forth to smooth it out, but for army painting, I don't give a shit. Again, if you give it enough time, you can make the filters look very seamless, but let's see how our cheap airbrush performs. Right off the bat, I noticed the splatter pattern happening again. So to counter this, I decided to hold the airbrush further away, which unfortunately makes it less precise. And truly, when I zoomed in real close, I saw that the paint distribution isn't as nice as I would like it to be. You might get away with it when priming, but honestly, at this point I don't see much usage out of this thing. The mid-range solution with a proper compressor offers much better paint dispersion. Since I am fully in control of the air and the paint released, I can do multiple quick passes over any part and make the filters as saturated as I want them to be. If I spray over into any part I didn't intend to cover, it's not a big deal, since just one quick pass won't be noticeable. And even though this is miles better than the dogshit airbrush and much faster than than the almighty paintbrush, it is indeed the premium airbrush, which was made for this test. Yes, it is true that it releases less paint than the previous airbrush, but that's actually an advantage here. With superb control, you can choose exactly how much paint you release, and it's not like it takes that much longer. It's also true that I mostly use this airbrush for display models, rather than army painting. So speed is not my priority. But again, it's not that much slower. So while it may seem like the premium airbrush is the overall winner, and you definitely need one, I wouldn't be so sure. For one, $200 for just the spray gun without any compressor is a lot. And I know some people who buy expensive shit and end up not using it. Because, well, it was expensive and they don't wanna f it up. Even I told you that I am not using my premium airbrush for priming, because it's prone to clogging. And if you spend so much money on a tool, I would hope that you use it to the maximum potential. Which I can't really say that I do with this one. So I want to take all of this information and answer the two initial questions. Do you really need an airbrush? And if so, which one? And to give you an answer, well, you don't need an airbrush. Everything you do with an airbrush can be done without it for sure. That goes for priming, glazing, varnishing, you name it. But if you want to be faster, if you want to be more consistent, and especially if you are painting armies, you'll benefit from airbrush tremendously. The increase in speed is so great that I would say it almost always pays off. I mean, as I said, you could literally just sketch all the light with it and apply a contrast paint over the Mini to have a better, cleaner version of slap chop. So yeah, you don't need an airbrush, but you would be missing out so much that it would be stupid to not even consider it. Now, if you have personally decided for yourself that you need one, let's talk about the real hero of airbrushing. The good old compressor. Out of the three airbrushing options we have used, I would consider just the latter two to be worth it. And that's not necessarily for the airbrushes themselves, but because you can adjust pressure using a compressor that doesn't suck ass. At the end of the day, airbrush is just a tool that spits out air and paint, and the most difference is in pressure and nozzle size. It is my genuine opinion that if you get an okay airbrush and a decent compressor, you're good. So in this regard, the mid-range solution will be the best bang for your buck, especially if you are army painting. Now, is there a case for buying premium airbrushes? Maybe. Premium airbrushes are said to have better control, should be cleaned more easily, and the parts should last longer. From my own limited experience when it comes to this particular airbrush, I can confirm that the control is a tiny bit better, but I wouldn't say that the cleaning is easier. Also, I don't know why, but for some reason this one has a really stiff trigger. Which really shouldn't be the case for $200. Now, if you are deep into hobby and you want the best control possible, then feel free to look into some premium airbrushes, but just letting you know, this model costs 10 times the amount of this one, and I'm not sure it's worth it. But hey, maybe there is something wrong with me. But anyway, there will be my recommended setup in the description, so feel free to check it out, and see you in the next one.